And today we've brought it all together through the 4 shifts of sustainable leadership. Remember, from control to clarity, from clarity to trusting the system, from fixing to coaching, and then finally from ownership to stewardship. Now, if these shifts begin to take hold in your practice, the entire experience of running a business changes. The practice becomes more stable, the team becomes more capable, and the emotional weight that you've been carrying begins to lift. That's the work of leadership. Not carrying everything yourself, but building something that works well even when you step back. The work that we've been doing through this series is about reclaiming that original vision, that dream, not by working harder, but by leading differently. That's the real promise of this series. That's the real promise of practice ownership, okay? Not just success, but sustainability in practice and in your life as well. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast, the podcast where I have the pleasure of simplifying the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your impact, your income, and your enjoyment in practice too. Now, today I want to start by reminding you of the dream that most of us as chiropractors began with, okay? Because when we start a practice, the vision is usually pretty damn clear. We imagine freedom, okay? Freedom to choose the hours that we want to work, freedom to choose the style of care that we want to deliver, freedom to choose the patients that we serve, freedom to build a team around us, and ultimately, freedom to build a life that works for us and for our families too. That's the dream of practice ownership. But the reality for many of us as chiropractors ends up looking very, very different. Instead of freedom, we find ourselves carrying an enormous pressure. Now, the practice depends on us for almost everything. Decisions flow back to us constantly. Staffing feels fragile. Standards feel difficult to maintain. And the biggest signal of all of this is that if we step away even for a short period of time, things start to wobble. Processes get missed, standards drift, and team confidence drops. So this means taking a holiday feels incredibly risky, okay? And expansion starts to feel almost completely unrealistically. And slowly, the practice becomes something that you serve instead of something that serves you. Now, over the last several episodes, we've been working through a leadership side of this problem because if you remember, I've said many times that chiropractors typically face one of 3 core challenges in practice, okay? The first is nobody knows you. This is a visibility problem or a marketing problem, okay? The second is no one stays. This is a trust and communication problem. And the third is no time or freedom in practice. And this is a leadership problem. Now, this series has been focused on that third problem, okay? Now, over the last few episodes, we've talked about how chiropractors unintentionally become the bottleneck in their own practice. We've talked about decision fatigue and how too many decisions end up sitting with you. We explored how to move from ownership of those decisions into passing them on to the team. And we built a structure that supports that ownership of standards, triggers, feedback loops, and review cadence, okay? And then we talked of the discipline of not stepping back in every time something feels uncomfortable, okay? And in the last episode, we unpacked how to lead through team mistakes using what I called the calm escalation framework, okay? So we've built a lot of leadership structure, but there's still one deeper shift that many chiropractors haven't made yet, okay? Even when the structure exists, even when the team has ownership, many chiropractors are still carrying the practice emotionally, okay? They still feel responsible for everything. They worry about what might go wrong. They check in more than they need to, and they hover around decisions, okay? They quietly step back in just to make sure things are done properly. Now, this is not necessarily because they want control. It's because they care. And today's episode is going to be about a leadership shift that allows you to finally let that weight go. Because sustainable leadership isn't just about systems and structure. It's about how you relate to the practice itself, okay? Let me say that again. Sustainable leadership isn't just about systems and structure. It's about how you relate to the practice itself. Now, today I want to introduce you to what I call the 4 shifts of sustainable leadership, okay? These are mindset shifts that allow chiropractors to stop carrying the practice emotionally and start leading it as a steward rather than as an operator, okay? And when this shift happens, something really interesting occurs. The practice stops depending on you and starts growing beyond you, all right? So let's dive in, okay? Let's overview, first of all, the 4 shifts of a sustainable leadership. Now, if chiropractors want to stop carrying the practice emotionally and start experiencing freedom, okay, the freedom they originally hoped for, there are 4 leadership shifts that need to occur. These shifts move you from being the center of the practice to being the steward of the practice, okay? Now, let me give you an overview first and then we'll dive into them. Shift number 1 is from control to clarity, okay? And this is your job is not to do everything correctly. Your job is to make sure that everybody knows what good looks like. So instead of jumping in to fix outcomes, you define the standards, the processes, the expectations that allow a team to produce the outcomes that you want consistently. Now, shift number 2, we now move from clarity to trusting the system. So once the standards exist, leadership requires a second shift. And instead of feeling the need to watch everything personally, okay, you begin to trust the structures that you've built, the standards, the triggers, the feedback loops, and the dashboards that show whether or not the system is working. Now, shift number 3, this now moves us from fixing to coaching. This is an important part of the journey. When things wobble, and they will, your role isn't to rescue the situation. It's to help the team grow inside of the system, okay? So this means that you move from solving problems yourself to developing people that can solve them for you. Now, the 4th and final shift is a shift from ownership to stewardship. This means you stop carrying the practice personally and you start protecting the system that allows the practice to function without you, okay? Now, what's interesting is that many chiropractors make the first shift operationally. They create procedures, they define standards, and they hire staff, but they never fully make the second shift psychologically, okay? They still feel like they need to watch everything, which is why even with standards, staff, and structure in place, they still feel like the practice depends on them. So let's walk through each of these shifts and what they actually look like inside a real chiropractic practice. Shift 1, from control to clarity. Now, most chiropractors start their leadership journey trying to control the outcomes, okay? And it's totally understandable. You do this because you care about your patients and the business, okay? You care about the standards of care. You care about the experience that people are going to have inside of your practice. So the natural instinct, therefore, is to stay close to everything. You check, you correct, and you step in when something doesn't feel quite right. But here's the leadership truth, okay? Control does not create consistency. Clarity does. Let me say that again. Control doesn't create consistency in your practice, but clarity does. When leaders try to control outcomes, the system is going to depend on their presence. But when leaders create clarity, the system can function without them, okay? So let me share with you what control looks like in practice, and you can see if some of these things look familiar for you. Because control often shows up really quite subtly, okay? The chiropractor might find themselves re-explaining things to patients at the checkout. They double check the recall list at the end of the day. They jump into conversations with a hesitant report of findings patients. They answer questions that the CA could have handled as well. Now, none of this looks dramatic, okay? And it often looks like you're being helpful, but the message it sends to your staff is really clear, okay? And that is, I'll make sure that things go right, okay? And when this happens repeatedly, the team never fully learns the right way to do things, okay? Or they never fully learn what right actually means, okay? Okay, so let's now talk about what clarity looks like in practice, because clarity is different. So instead of hovering around the task, the chiropractor defines the standard. So for example, if we thought about the report of findings checkout standard, every patient finishes their report of findings, leaves with their next visits booked, and are clear on their financial commitments, okay? Maybe the missed visit standard. Again, missed visits are contacted within 15 minutes and rebooked within 24 hours. Or perhaps there's an internal referral standard. When a patient mentions improvement or a family member with a similar problem, the CA invites that conversation about who else may benefit from care. Now, notice what's happening here. The chiropractor isn't controlling the moment, they're defining what success looks like. And once that standard is clear, the team can execute it. Now, there's some things that you're going to need to watch out for here, because the trap that chiropractors fall into is that thinking that clarity is obvious, okay? But what feels obvious to us as a chiropractors is often invisible to our staff. So if you find yourself thinking or saying, I thought they knew that, or I shouldn't have to explain this again, or isn't this common sense? That's usually a signal that clarity hasn't been fully created yet, okay? Sustainable leadership starts when expectations move from your head into the structure of the practice. And once clarity exists, something really interesting happens. You no longer need to control every outcome because the system, okay, knows what good looks like. Which now leads us to the second shift, and that is moving from monitoring everything to trusting the structure that you have built. Okay, so this is from clarity to trusting the system. So the first shift we talked about was control to clarity. That shift is very operational, okay? It's about defining standards so the practice knows what good outcomes look like and they don't depend on you personally stepping in. But once clarity exists, the next leadership challenge appears. And this one here is much more psychological, okay? And that is you have to trust the system that you built. Because many successful chiropractors create clarity, okay? They define the process, the triggers, and the ownership. But emotionally, they still feel like they need to watch everything. Okay, not because they don't trust the team, but because historically, when things stopped working, okay, when they stopped watching, then things started to slip. So even with the structure in place, they end up staying mentally tethered to the operation. So here's what this lack of trust looks like in practice. The standards exist, the recall process has been defined, the report of finding checkout procedure is clear, the triggers are documented, ownership is assigned, and yet you still feel the need to check. Maybe it's to glance at the recall list, to double check whether missed visits were contacted, to quietly scan the schedule, okay, to make sure after the report of findings that patient was booked in. Now, again, there's nothing dramatic here, but there's just a subtle sense that if you don't keep an eye on things, then standards might slip. Now, that's not control anymore. That's a lack of trust in the system. So why is it that this actually happens? It happens because most chiropractors spent years operating in survival mode, okay? When something went wrong, you were the safety net, okay? You fixed the mistake. You smoothed out the patient interaction. You stepped in when the system actually failed. And over time, that creates a powerful internal belief. Belief is this, that the practice only works because I'm watching it. So even when structure improves, the nervous system, your nervous system hasn't caught up yet, okay? Leadership now requires a second shift, moving from clarity to trusting the system to carry that clarity. So let me show you what trusting the system looks like, because trust doesn't mean disengagement. It means the practice has visible signals that show whether the system is working. So instead of watching everything personally, you create visibility. So for example, missed visits are tracked on a simple recall list. Report of findings conversions are visible on a weekly dashboard, and internal referrals are noted and celebrated in the team meeting. Now, you're not watching people, you're observing the system, okay? If the numbers drift, we investigate, okay? If the system holds, then you step back, okay? The trust comes from the structure, all right? Now, when chiropractors make this shift, something really powerful happens. The team starts acting with more confidence because they know the standard, they know the triggers, they know the system will show them whether things are working or not, which naturally leads to the next shift. And this is shift number 3, from fixing to coaching. Now, once you trust the system, the next leadership challenge appears when something goes wrong. A patient interaction doesn't go well, a recall isn't followed up, a report of findings checkout isn't handled the way that it ought to. And in that moment, you can feel a really strong pull. And the pull is to come in and fix this yourself, to step in, to smooth things over, to make the call personally. It feels helpful, it feels efficient. But every time you fix the outcome yourself, you accidentally teach the system something really powerful, and that is when things matter, the chiropractor steps back in. And this means that ownership slowly collapses, okay? And this is where the third leadership happens, okay? Moving from fixing problems to coaching people inside the system. So let me show you here. What is it that fixing looks like? So fixing is very outcome focused. The patient needs reassurance, so you jump back in, okay? Maybe you hop on the phone. The checkout didn't go well, so you take over the conversation. The recall wasn't done, so you make the call yourself. Now, the immediate problem gets solved, but the system doesn't learn, and therefore the team doesn't grow. So what is it that coaching looks like? Coaching still protects the outcome, but it develops the person responsible for the process. So instead of stepping in, you slow down for a moment, okay? And you ask questions. You help them see the standard and you help them practice the correction. So the goal shifts from solving today's problem to strengthening tomorrow's capacity. So here's a really simple example. Let's imagine that a CA mishandles a report of findings checkout. The patient leaves unsure about the care plan and doesn't book their next visits. Now, the fixing response might be to call the patient yourself and clean it up, or to get another CA to do that. The coaching response, however, looks very different, okay? You would sit down with a CA, either at that stage or when next was available, and you would walk through the moment. Now, you might say something like this. Talk me through what happened at the end of that report of findings there with Sue. You revisit the standard, you role play the conversation, and you help them practice how to confidently guide the patient into the next steps of care, okay? The patient outcome still gets addressed if needed, but the real win is the team member becomes more capable next time, okay? That's super important. Now, when chiropractors make this shift, something important changes. The practice stops depending on you to rescue outcomes, and instead, the team becomes stronger with every challenge, all right? And that leads here to the final shift, the fourth shift. And this is moving from ownership to stewardship, perhaps the most important of all of the shifts. So this final shift is one that most chiropractors feel rather than intellectually understand. Because even after systems exist, even after the team has grown, and even after the practice is running well, many of you still feel like you carry the weight of the practice emotionally, okay? If something goes wrong, it feels like it's your fault. If numbers dip, you feel personally responsible. If a team member struggles, it feels like the whole practice is unstable. That's the weight of ownership, okay? So let me show you again what ownership looks like in practice, okay? Again, it looks like this. The practice works because of me. If I step away, things might fall apart. I have to keep holding everything together, and the emotional posture of this keeps you tethered to the practice, okay? Now, you might be able to take some time off physically, but mentally, you're always going to be inside of your practice, all right? So what is it that stewardship looks like? Because stewardship is different, okay? Stewardship says this: my role is to protect the system that allows this practice to work, not to carry it personally, not to hold every outcome, but to make sure that the structure stays healthy, okay? Now, the standard remains clear, okay? The feedback loops stay visible. The team continues to grow. A steward tends to the environment though, okay? They don't carry the weight of every outcome. So what does this look like in practice? When chiropractors shift into stewardship, their focus changes. So instead of asking, did this go perfectly? They ask, is the system improving, okay? Instead of reacting to every wobble, they observe patterns. Instead of carrying the emotional weight of every result, they invest their energy in strengthening the practice architecture, okay? Now, over time, something remarkable starts to happen. The practice becomes more stable. Not because the chiropractor or the team is working harder, but because the leadership posture has changed, okay? When chiropractors complete these 4 shifts, moving from control to clarity, from clarity to trusting the system, from fixing to coaching, and then finally from ownership to stewardship, something incredibly powerful happens. The practice stops revolving around you, and that's when freedom actually begins to appear. Now, it's worth zooming out just for a moment here, because when chiropractors make these 4 shifts, The change in the practice is not going to be immediate, okay, but it will be profound over time. So over the next 6 to 12 months, several things begin to happen. The team is going to start making more decisions independently, okay? Small problems will get solved without escalating to you. Conversations shift from what should we do to here's what we did. Just imagine that for a moment, okay? The conversation shifting from what should we do to here's what we do. Here's what we did. Standards begin to stabilize because they live in the structure of the practice, not in your head. And most importantly, the emotional load of the practice is going to lift, okay? You're going to no longer feel like you have to watch everything. You no longer feel responsible for every wobble. And instead, you're able to look at the practice the way a CEO or an owner would from a slightly higher vantage point, okay? You'll be able to observe patterns, strengthen systems, and support the growth of your team. And over time, this is what creates something many chiropractors thought was impossible when they started their practice, and that is real freedom. The freedom to step away for a holiday without worrying about the wheels falling off. The freedom to reduce your hours if you choose. The freedom to grow the practice or simply enjoy the one that you've built. And importantly, the freedom to practice chiropractic because you love it, not because the practice cannot function without you, okay? So as we wrap up this leadership series, let's briefly recap the journey that we have taken together, okay? We started with a problem that many chiropractors quietly carry, okay? And that is the feeling that the practice needs them all the time. The feeling that if they step away, that things will slip, okay? And from there, what we did is we introduced the CEO check-in. We created space to think about the practice instead of constantly reacting inside of it. We explored how chiropractors unintentionally become the bottleneck of their own business. We unpacked decision fatigue and why carrying all those decisions in your head is so incredibly exhausting. We moved decisions into ownership and we built structural elements that allow a practice to run well of standards, triggers, feedback loops, and review cadence. And then we talked about how to protect your freedom when things wobble, using the 3-question filter before stepping back in. We explored how to lead through team mistakes with the calm escalation framework. And today we've brought it all together through the 4 shifts of sustainable leadership, okay? Remember, from control to clarity, from clarity to trusting the system, from fixing to coaching, and then finally from ownership to stewardship. Now, if these shifts begin to take hold in your practice, the entire experience of running a business changes. The practice becomes more stable, the team becomes more capable, okay? And the emotional weight that you've been carrying begins to lift, okay? That's the work of leadership. Not carrying everything yourself, but building something that works well even when you step back, okay? And I want to come back to something that we mentioned earlier at the very beginning of the episode, okay? And remember, most chiropractors start a practice with a very clear dream, okay? It's the dream of freedom. Freedom to choose their hours, freedom to choose the type of patients that you want to serve, freedom to build the team and the culture that you're proud of, and freedom to build something meaningful for your family and for your community. But somewhere along the way, that dream quietly gets replaced with something else: stress and responsibility, the feeling that the practice needs you every minute of the day, okay? The work that we've been doing through this series is about reclaiming that original vision, that dream, not by working harder, but by leading differently, okay? Now, again, when these shifts start to take hold, when control becomes clarity, when clarity becomes trust, okay? When problems become opportunities to coach, and when ownership becomes stewardship, when that happens, the practice is going to feel different, okay? You're going to still be deeply involved. You'll still care about the outcomes, but here's important. You're no longer carrying the entire practice emotionally on your shoulders. You've built something that actually works, a team that can grow, a structure that holds standards as well, a practice that can continue to thrive even when you step back for a much-deserved holiday. That's the real promise of this series. That's the real promise of practice ownership, okay? Not just success, but sustainability in practice and in your life as well. All right, so that's it, folks. Thanks for joining me on this series. I know it's been a lot that we've covered as well, and it might be something that you need to dive into several times here. My sincerest hope is that this series helps to move you closer to the practice that you've always dreamed of. Thanks for all that you do. Keep saving lives, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week. Bye.